Welcome to the Studio Talk podcast. I'm Xiomara, your co-host. Every week, we speak to our community members to teach them about mental health through education and awareness, and our hope is to inspire them through social change advocacy. We also interview community members and other mental health professionals, clinicians, healers, students, and wellness professionals. Our style is storytelling. Everyone has a mental health story to tell. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional and is not a substitute for psychological diagnosis or treatment. It's purely educational and purely social change advocacy. If you find yourself in any sort of mental health emergency or distress, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.
Hey everyone, this is Studio Talk with episode number 2, Getting Started in Therapy. So we're going to go over a lot of things today about what it looks like to start therapy, if you know that you need therapy or just would benefit from it, all that kind of stuff. So we tried to get a collection of questions that we think are frequently asked. So the first one is how to know if you need therapy. I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Hi everyone, this is Xiomara, your co-host, and so we thought this would be a really great follow-up to episode 1 where we explained what counts mental health and mental illness and the differences and all of those good things. So since today we're going to be talking about getting started in therapy. What do we mean by that? What we really mean by that is, when does a person come to terms with the fact that they should at least consider talking to a counselor or a therapist? Mm-hmm. How does that come about? What does that look like? What steps should they take? Because a lot of people, even if they're at the, what is the stage where the pre-contemplative, I think is what it's called, stage where they're thinking about it, they're considering it, but they're really not sure how to, or even if they should take that step, because there's a lot of barriers involved. Yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's see. Our first point is going to be kind of explaining the difference between what we as mental health providers consider the need, us individuals needing mental health services, as opposed to benefiting from mental health services. So we're going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think a lot of us will just kind of casually say like, oh, I need therapy, or, she needs therapy, or this couple needs therapy for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think need is emphasized a little too much in those situations where, who really needs therapy? And Xiomara and I were talking about this before we got on the podcast, that we think that someone who is in crisis needs therapy, or, I do think anyone who's having serious thoughts of self-harm or harming others might need therapy or some kind of therapeutic intervention. But a lot of us might not necessarily need therapy, but it would benefit us in some way. I think that's where most of my clients are, Well,
and you can look at it as the difference between going for treatment as opposed to, or an intervention, for example, as opposed to doing prevention work or doing, what's that word? There's a word for it, where you kind of want to avoid ever getting to the point where you need therapy. So if you can sense that there are things going wrong that you need to work out, that you need to process, that you need to deal with, so that you don't get to the point where you actually need to go to therapy and do therapeutic work, where you're just going to process things. You're just going to kind of heal. You're going to get to a point where you feel much more grounded and much more able to handle whatever is going on in your life that's causing you stress and causing you distress, as opposed to, for example, overdosing and then having to be forced into some sort of treatment where you need that therapy to deal with it. So I think language is a big deal, and we seem to always come around to that. You ever notice that? We always come around to the language that we use and the language that people use when dealing with mental health. And that's what we did with the whole difference between mental health and mental illness episode. And I think in this episode, we're going to talk about the language that our community members use, and even us counselors and therapists use, when we're talking about people who could benefit from therapy and who can benefit from counseling, which again, two terms that are thrown around, which will kind of clarify the difference between the two of them, and needing to go.
Yeah.
So.
And I like the point that you made about preventative care, that you don't necessarily always want to wait until you need therapy to actually go to it. You don't want to wait until you're in crisis to go to therapy. There are warning signs that are alerting you that, hey, maybe you need to go talk to someone about what's going on. And I think some of those warning signs, a big one that I hear and have experienced is just this feeling of being overwhelmed. Right? Maybe you don't necessarily have a mental illness that we talked about last episode, but life is just overwhelming you. You might be feeling an excess of emotion like anger or sadness, or you're crying very often, or you're snapping at your partner more often. There's our brains send us warning signs before we go into a full-blown crisis. And it's important to listen to those warning signs.
Yeah. And it's important, again, for everyone who's listening, there are some people who are just naturally irritable. So if that's their norm and that's their sort of baseline where they're just generally irritable people, I don't want people to start worrying that, oh my God, I might be able to benefit from. No. But if you're typically not someone who's easily irritable or angered or anything like that, and you're finding that any little thing is triggering you and you're so irritated with everybody and everything, and your life seems to be irritating, everything in your life seems to be triggering some sort of, emotion that is not the norm, is not your baseline, and it doesn't stop, it just continues and escalates and it doesn't go away and it starts to interfere, then I would say that you're getting to the point where you need to go talk to somebody and sort of figure out because most of the times we do know what that thing is. We just think that we've dealt with it and we've processed it, or we ran 10 miles and now we feel better and it's okay,
I need therapy, it's fine.
Yeah, we had a girls' night out and now we're good. No. So, we're not trying to muddy the waters or anything like that. But, and then the other thing too is if you're diagnosed with something and you know that you're diagnosed with something, and like in my case with clinical depression, and that's something that I've had and that I managed and all that, and I start having specific symptoms that I need to be really aware of, then I know I need to go get my counseling and therapy in and figure out what I need to tweak and what I need to, But on the other hand, if I'm feeling overwhelmed in all of these things, and it just has to do with work is a lot, the pandemic, the people around me are having problems, I feel, so much overwhelm or whatever from that kind of stuff, I would benefit from a counselor helping guide me through those things. So.
Yeah, and also figuring out the level of therapy that you need, kind of what we talked about before too. Yeah. Like, do I need support? Do I need actual treatment? Do I need, trying to figure out what specific person you need to go to also can be a lot to navigate. But we're going to get into it.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. So let's talk about, this point that we kind of want to talk about a little bit is children. Because as adults, we're supposed to be able to advocate for ourselves. We're supposed to be able to be self-aware enough, to understand when we need to go see a provider, when we need to speak to whoever we think can help us. But children can't. We speak on their behalf. So we're responsible for trying to figure out if and when they can benefit from and or they need some kind of therapy or counseling. So where and who and how does that happen? That's not something that I necessarily have a whole lot of experience in or is part of my practice. I do have some clients that, are youngsters, but that's not really an area that I do a lot of work in, and that's by choice. So what's your sense about with children needing?
So I wouldn't say I have an extensive history of working with kids either, but I have had multiple kids on my caseload at one point, and I think some of the common things that we've seen are like emotional regulation issues, right? Kids don't have adult set of skills to regulate their emotions, right? But when it's different than their peers, I think that's something to be mindful of. Are their teachers saying something about their behavior? isolation. If your kids are isolating themselves a lot, if they're saying a lot of negative things about themselves, like really just poor self-esteem issues, bullying issues.
Yeah, that's a big one.
You know, those kind of things should always be listened to and taken seriously. Not to the point where you have to be really worried when stuff like that happens, but you don't want to ignore those things for sure.
Yeah, I think with kids, for me, what I have found fascinating is the way that they express their emotions, like artistically, when they're painting or drawing or something. I'm no expert in that area. I do not interpret that. I do not know how. And I've actually recently had someone who did a group with someone who that is her specialty, and another person was talking about a kid who was drawing in their sessions and whatever, and she really made this big point of saying, that's great, let them do that, let them process that and everything, but be very careful not to allow the temptation to take over for you to interpret what they are painting and drawing.
Yeah.
Be very cautious. And that makes sense to me, because if I saw a painting of like a nephew or a niece or, you know, a little stick figure or whatever, and something was alarming, you know, or seemed alarming, my knee-jerk reaction would be, oh my God, we have to take, you know, like them to doing, but I don't feel comfortable in doing that anymore, because it sounds like people who work in that area and who really specialize in that area don't necessarily think that that's what the alarming part is. That maybe that's a way of them expressing. I don't know. But I think that with children, it's always in the best interest. If we're professionals and we're sitting here saying, we're not sure, so we would have to go consult with someone who really understands those issues, then I would really encourage any, you know, mom, dad, aunt, whoever's out there taking care of the little ones, that don't take it upon yourself to figure out, you know, if you really, really are wondering and you are very concerned, talk to someone who really does know how this works, and let them, you know, advise you on what steps to take. Because maybe a lot of times they don't need it. I don't know. But that's a touchy one. People are very touchy about whether kids go get therapy and don't get therapy and all medication. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a mom, but I would definitely be very touchy about that. Like when I do have kids, you know, I'm going to be very defensive, and I don't know how I would feel if a teacher or someone said, oh, your kid needs therapy. Yeah. I was like, bitch, you need therapy.
Yeah. You don't know.
So I understand parents' reaction to, you know, being very defensive. One problematic area that I did run into was parents' expectation of what would happen with their child in therapy. Meaning, you know, I am having all these problems with my kid. I'm going to drop him off 1 hour a week with you, and you're going to fix him. Yeah. I've actually had parents specifically tell me, I need you to fix my child in front of the child. Wow. So you can imagine having a kid hear their mom say, you know, I need to be fixed by someone. That's pretty damaging. So back to language. Right. Try not to use the word fix. Even when clients come in, they say, please fix me. You don't need to be fixed because you're not broken. Yeah. Right. So, but back to expectations of parents when they, you know, bring their kids to therapy, it's a collaborative effort. So the therapist needs to work with you and the child and maybe other family members. You know, it's a joint effort. It's not, the therapist is not a wizard. They're not going to be able to just,
with
you know,
magic powers.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
And you know, the recipe, we have the recipe for that. Every kid is so different, and you know, as much as we wish that we had a one size fits all kind of thing, it's not like that. And so, you know, and sometimes when children, and because, you know, I know in my experience with dealing with children and all that, a lot of the times what I've observed is the child's actually responding to a dysfunctional family unit. The child seems to be fine when the child is alone. You know, they can pretty much express and talk like normal children when they're in that room alone, kind of thing. And then once the parents or the family or the sister, anybody else is involved, suddenly that child reverts to this thing or whatever the problematic. So, you know, the scapegoat or whatever, but who knows what the issue is. So like the whole systems therapy, family therapy thing is to me a big thing. I think everybody, if there's one problem with one person in the family, my suspicion is that everybody can benefit from not just the family counseling and the individual counseling with the child, but maybe do some kind of work on the family as a family unit.
Yeah.
Even if it is that one child that's exhibiting symptoms of problematic behavior.
Yeah.
We don't know if it could be coming from it. And something that comes to mind, which is unfortunate that this happens, but the thing that comes to mind with me is abuse, with children, sexual abuse or physical abuse or mental abuse, but very, very specifically sexual abuse. If that's going on and that's happening with a child and the child doesn't even have words for that, and it's somebody who's supposed to be caring for them and all that, and they're traumatized and they're scared, or they've been told, don't say because I will, whatever, your mom or your dad. Like, it's just very complicated, ugly situation. And they're bringing that child in because they're acting out, they're cutting themselves, they're suicidal, they're whatever is going on, and you're supposed to work on the kid and work on the, and help the kid, but meanwhile the problem is really another perpetrator.
Yeah.
That is, you have to be skilled and you have to really be very astute in what you're doing, to figure, because I'm thinking about a case when I used to do case management, and I used to have to go to the houses, to remove children, which was not a favorite of my thing to do, but we would go, and there was one child who was the victim of sexual abuse, and the mom knew, everybody knew it, social workers knew it and all that, and we were going to the house to do the home visits, and the perpetrator was another child, a brother, and they were living there, so it was two children, living together, but the victim child was the one that was exhibiting all of the the behaviors where they thought that was the child that had the issues and the problems, but really that was the victim. So there was nothing wrong with that child. That child was, that reaction was very normal to what was happening with her. What wasn't okay was that the perpetrator was there, your abuser lived there. And so you had to remove, the ideal for me, this is just my opinion, and social workers have their, policies that they follow and their things that they follow. But, it used to be once upon a time when you would remove the victim, grab the victim, take them out of the house, and then just disrupt their whole life. Where now I see that things are done the other way around, where remove the perpetrator. That makes more sense. And you'll see how this child who you thought had the problematic behavior will probably, with therapy and help and counseling and all that, start getting back to their baseline where they were responding before. Now that threat and that is gone and is out, and they're doing therapy on that child, and they've removed the thing that is causing, the situation that is causing this. So, it's just, again, you have to be skilled. I feel like there are people who specialize in those areas for a reason. Because those are very scary situations. But with children, is particularly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say that if you are thinking about getting your child in to see a counselor, especially someone, younger than 12, I would highly recommend to go see a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist who specializes in working with children.
Yeah.
Because it is very different than a therapist who specializes in working with adults.
Right. And not that, we're all sort of have an idea on what we can do to get the ball rolling. But to really do the long-term therapy and all that, people who specialize in that is where I would encourage. And I do encourage people to go.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of dropping somebody off and saying, here, fix them, that's
happens.
something I know. But no. All right. So what are some of the barriers to starting therapy? And before we move forward, because we keep saying therapy, but I want everyone to understand counseling and therapy and why we use those terms. We interchange those terms, and we call ourselves counselors and that kind of thing. And Victoria and I have had conversations about that. And we're going to do a podcast someday about what different mental health providers are and what they all do and why they have different titles: psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors and all that. We're all therapists, all psychiatrists and psychologists and clinical social workers and, all those titles. We are all therapists. We all do psychotherapy. We all do therapy. We all have fundamentally the same training to do all of that. Some of us have a title of clinical counselor, like we do. Some people have the title of psychologist, clinical psychologist, and all those sorts of things. But counseling and therapy are basically the same thing. The biggest difference between the two is that one is much more specific and long-term, and the other one is much more short-term. So someone can come in to do counseling for a few sessions, for a few months, and not necessarily have, you have your goals and your treatment and all of that to do that, and you're dealing with the life issues, adjusting to college, adjusting to the pandemic and all those kind of, you get counseling, you do all that kind of stuff. Therapy is much more entailed, much more specific, much more particular. So if you come in and you have a particular disorder that you're like eating disorder, I'm just going to use that because if you have an eating disorder and there's a particular therapy involved with dealing with that, and it requires a certain amount of time and all kinds of evidence-based ways that we deal with that, that's where we use the term therapy more often. So when you hear us sort of using both those terms interchangeably, just know that they're the same thing. The main difference is that one is usually shorter and doesn't require the long amount of time than the other one does.
Yeah, and I didn't even know that until you explained it to me. Yeah. And sometimes I get confused on how I should introduce myself, because I think people get confused when you say, oh, I'm a counselor, because there's so many. Are you a camp counselor, an admissions counselor, a financial counselor? And then I started saying, well, I'm a therapist, which I think sounds more professional anyways. Oh, I'm a therapist. And then I get people saying like, oh, my shoulder really hurts. Right. Can you like help me with it? No, I'm not a physical therapist. So I don't even know what to introduce myself as anymore.
No, that's why I stick with clinical mental health counselor, because
straightforward.
My education, that's the title I was given when I received that degree, so that's the one that I stick with. And I am very particular with clinical, and I explain this to my clients why that's important, because anyone can throw a little sign up on the door and say, I am a counselor, coaches. And and they misrepresent themselves because they're doing what they perceive counseling to be, but it's not clinical, because they cannot diagnose. They should not be diagnosing. They should not be providing treatment, or treatment plan or anything like that. If there are counselors, for example, pastoral counseling, community counselors at a community center, they do, supportive stuff. They help you get through situations and things like that, but they cannot diagnose, they cannot treat. They are not supervised. They're not under a board. There's no, So it's really important for my clients that I explain to them that little shingle on my door is not just me throwing it up there and saying, hey, come on in, I'm doing
I earned that shingle.
And I'm still earning it. And I still don't know how much more I don't know about what I'm doing. So anyway, so that's the difference between counseling and therapy. There's really no difference other than the amount of time depending on what you're coming in for. That's really it. So that's really what it comes down to. And the only people that should be doing any sort of clinical counseling are the people that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. All right. So there's that. Anyway, so barriers. So some of the barriers. You want to talk about the first?
Sure. So I think the biggest one is pretty obvious. It's still the stigma of therapy services, counseling services. A lot of people still feel that, asking for help is something that they're uncomfortable with. A lot of people don't want to go to therapy because they don't want to be seen as mentally ill, which I think is a big thing we covered last episode, that you don't have to be mentally ill to go to therapy. I think going to therapy is an admission that something's wrong, and a lot of people don't want to sit there and say something is wrong. Or to get judged for other people. So, even after graduate school, it was hard for me to go to therapy. And that was really eye-opening for me because, here I am advocating that there's no stigma with therapy and everybody should go and, have my little normalized therapy bumper sticker. And I'm on Psychology Today saying, I don't need this. I don't need to go. I'm fine. And I was really nervous making that phone call, too. And I don't even know why.
That's interesting. Yeah. I love going to my...
I love it now.
I love making counseling and appointments and therapy appointments.
Yeah, it's super easy now, and it's no problem, but it's, it's definitely still there. Even if it's not from society, it's internal. We internalize that judgment.
I sometimes when I'm in session and I'll mention something, like if we're talking about something that makes sense and I feel is going to be beneficial to the client, and they're bringing up a topic and I just mention, yeah, when I was talking to my counselor about my depression, when I was going through that, I can see the look on their face, like, oh, like sometimes it's like pure shock. Like, what? You mental health counselors go to counseling? Or,
yeah.
and then you worry because you're like, oh, they're going to think that now
I'm
I'm not
unstable.
I can't. Like, is the stigma going to cause them to walk out? That's never happened.
I make jokes about that all the time, you know?
Because, listen, at the end of the day, like I said, everybody has things that they need help with, dealing with. Some things, we just need help with things, and it's okay. And these people, and to me, honestly, I'd rather go to someone who I feel is qualified to help me overcome something that I need to really overcome than to sit around and ask my friends and family and everything to help me with this issue when I know that they're not qualified for it. They're qualified to hold my hand and let me cry and, bitch, moan, and complain, but they can't really do therapeutic counseling with me. So, so I think that, stigma, I'm glad to see that it's something that's being dealt with, that is really, it is kind of starting to get kicked to the curb, depending on, and I worry about that too, because I think last episode I mentioned, now celebrities and whoever, influencers or whatever, mentioned that they have whatever it is that they think they have, because a lot of them self-diagnose. And now it's like the hip cool thing to be able to sit, because it's like, oh, bipolar, I'm so bipolar. And that's not where we were going with the whole make it normalize it thing, know. But it's helping have conversations about it, and it's helping people feel a little bit less stigmatized that they choose. And then the pandemic has really, I think, shifted that. I think that stigma, fear of judgment, and all of that. If there was ever a good thing that could have come out of the pandemic, I think that's one of the things that may have come out of that, is that people recognize that there's no shame in asking for help, because these things can be overwhelming, and sometimes we really feel that it takes a toll on us, and we need someone to help guide us.
I think there was some kind of like movement that was saying, it's okay to not be okay out of the pandemic. I kept seeing that slogan everywhere, which is true, and I agree with you. I love that the stigma it's decreased a ton, I feel, in the past 10 years. Like from when I was in college to now is night and day, in my opinion. But
I do think people need to be careful with that too, because it's just I just cringe sometimes when I feel like it's being used as that hip new thing that it kind of makes you cool and hip to say you've got, and we have to be careful with that, because that's not what it should be about, but yet it's what's getting, I'll never forget in my communities, which there are several that I belong in, there are so many barriers to why my people would not go get, people of color, BIPOC community, all of that, LGBT community, all of that. We all had very real reasons why, very real barriers to why we would go, speak to someone in the mental health field. But I remember when I was first started to do this work in 2003 or something like that, when I lived in Florida, and there was this very popular Latina magazine that was just all, the rage, and getting online was like the big thing and all that stuff. And they were reaching out to all of us who were doing community work and advocacy work, and I was one of those people, to talk about, to interview and get, articles and stuff like that. And I really wanted to do mental health. Like, I was like, I would really like to have a conversation about, depression in our community and what's happening to our people, because they're not finding, especially if they're the immigrant community who are displaced and all that kind of stuff. And I remember, and it was a Latina in charge of this magazine. And she said, oh no, I'm sorry. We're not going to do that. That's not sexy enough. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to talk about it. Like, why are you calling me? Like, I'm not the fashion person. I'm not I'm not the makeup person. I'm none of those things. So if you're calling me to talk about something important in your magazine, and I'm telling you, how about the fact that we have Latina suicide rates were just off the charts at that time. And I wanted to talk about why and how come and whatever. And no, flat out, and had no problem. So talk about stigma inducing. Like, if I was Joe Schmo trying to talk about this and that lady said, this is an influential person in my community saying, like, and I remember if I didn't have good self-esteem and, that, I would have felt really stupid. I really felt really inferior, that how dare I want to talk about this subject that was just so, and so whatever, when they wanted to find out. And I was so mad. And then, of course, like a few years later, it became a hip thing or whatever. And who's calling and reaching out and wanting to talk? And it's like, I refuse to talk to you. No, no, you cannot have I will give it to somebody else, because that is exactly what I've been combating in our community. And you are like the epitome of the problem by doing that when you have this platform. And of course, that was before we could get online and tweet and do things, so we had to depend on them. But yeah, so that's a good example, I think, of a barrier. And,
yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. The other one is health insurance. We touched on this last episode, how that really plays a big role in all health care, But mental health care in particular is like, the little sad cousin that never gets added to it. The sad cousin that kind of gets left out of everything. But now it seems to be more included in health plans and more covered and all that kind of stuff. But, again, not everybody has health insurance. It's expensive. People can't afford it and all kinds of stuff. You want to talk about health insurance?
I don't know much about health insurance because I don't take it. Yeah. I mean, the biggest reason is that I literally cannot accept health insurance because of my license right now. But,
okay, let's clarify that.
Let's clarify that.
You have a bad license.
Yeah, I'm not on probation or anything anymore.
Her license isn't in trouble.
No, we just need, so I have a provisional license, and so we have to get thousands of hours of actual client contact and supervision, all this kind of stuff, and to finally qualify for the full license.
Yeah. Well, licensure where you can practice alone. Right now we have clinical supervisors that make sure we're going down the right path. Yes. And so we don't take insurance because we can't, but also a lot of fully licensed and experienced and mental health providers choose not to. And we talked about that last episode. So I'll put some info about that down in the show notes, and people will probably ask questions about that. But health insurance is a big reason why people can't or don't choose to do anything about it. So even if they have health insurance, though, they opt out of using it because of the fear of being found out, by the health insurance company, and then reporting it to the people I work for, and then that being, which, nowadays is a lot harder to do stuff like that, but that's still sort of like the old thinking around that. And, health insurance really ties in there with cost, and even if you do, direct pay to the counselors, like we have it set up, it's not easy for them to come in and pay $100, and my rate is $125 and your rate is something a little different, but it's still difficult for people to be able to come up with that and pay out of their pocket.
Yeah, especially if it's weekly, that adds up, and I understand that 100%. And I think some people feel confused why therapy is so expensive. But, when you think about, the therapist is making $125 an hour, it sounds like a pretty sweet gig. And you're a millionaire by now, right?
Right, yeah.
That's not how it goes down. There's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that therapists who are in private practice have to pay for. And, I promise that most of us try to make those prices as reasonable and ethical as possible and still be able to keep our lights on. Yeah, and I think the idea that you walk in and you spend 50 minutes with us and then you go away and we never think about you again until you come back is sort of a misnomer, because then we have a lot of work that we do behind the scenes between the time you leave our office and come back the next time. There's lots of hours that goes into our researching and thinking and planning and treatment and consulting and preparing and writing notes and all sorts of boring stuff. So, all right, we're not trying to justify why we charge what we charge, but this is why it's an issue for people to come in. Now, in that light, I will say that in my practice, I really have always and still have a huge component of it that deals with trying to serve
my underserved communities and trying to provide a way that a good chunk of people in my community, if they are unable to afford my rates, that I can work with them. And, a sliding scale is one way that I do it, and membership options is another way. And, and you just get very creative about how and what you can offer to people to try to offer the help that you have, for them. And I find that a good balance of both those things work for me right now. I don't know if that'll always be the case, and that wasn't always the case, but that's an option. So for individuals who are trying to find people who do sliding scale, find people who will work with them and do payment plans and things like that, it's the main way that you will find out is you go to that person's website. I mean, it's as simple as that. You have to go to the person's website, you have to look on their services and fees page, and you have to see what they charge, and you have to look at what they offer in terms of sliding scale and insurance. Sliding scale basically means that they provide services at a much reduced rate, but you have to qualify for that. So you can't be making $150,000 a year and say you want a sliding scale. You really can't, because those options are reserved for individuals who really, really need it. Like, I have a few single moms with children who have very low income and they can't afford that rate, and I want to help them, and so I do a significantly lower rate with them and work with them and that kind of thing. So that's another option, for people who don't have insurance, is look for somebody who provides that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about cultural barriers in underserved communities. I am not going to get into a whole bunch of detail about that because I am going to do podcasts on each group, because that's what they deserve. And the groups that I'm specifically talking about are the Latino, Latinx community, the LGBTQ community, the BIPOC, the veterans. Those are the groups that I work with mostly, and women. So there are lots of barriers that each of those groups very specifically have to deal with, and many of them have to do with Latinos in particular. It's just a cultural actually with all of them, it's a cultural competency piece, which is a really big deal in why they would choose to go to counseling or not go to counseling. In my case, I mean, I have my clients come to me from, Greenville and all kinds of places, because they're very specifically looking for a place where they can go and not have to explain their entire cultural existence to, so that they get the appropriate kind of attitude from their counselor. Or they've had an experience with providers prior to that who try to sort of fit them into the same box that they're non-BIPOC, By the way, that BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. LGBTQ is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus blah, 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 community. Latinx used to be Latino, Latina, Hispanic. Now they sort of try to make it. I'm not a big fan of the word Latinx, but for the sake of shortening it, that's that. Then you have the gender minorities and veterans and women. So they all have very unique needs, very specific needs. Women veterans, their big barrier, is that they don't want to go if they've experienced military sexual trauma, if they've experienced harassment, if they've experienced a lot of negative things in their service, and they really need to get mental health services. They really, really used to struggle with going to the VA to get mental health. And the reason for that is that they would be in a waiting room with a bunch of men, and that would make them uncomfortable. They would have to deal with a male, provider, which that would make them uncomfortable. Yeah. And I know that sounds sexist in some way, but when we do the podcast on that, I'll shed some light on why it's important that they have, women-centered places to go to where they can feel safe and do the work that they need to do, and not just in mental health, but also in their primary care. So with veterans, that's a big thing. Among the fact that, there's been major scheduling issues, there's a backlog, there's not enough providers within the, VA system anyway to provide all the services for everyone. The waiting lists are long. And then what kind of discharge you had really dictates what services you get. So it's very, so those barriers come up. And then, with the Latino community, obviously, depending on which which community you're dealing with within that community. You have language issues. You have the fear that someone's family member might not be documented, and they don't know. People have told them that if, you go see this provider, you don't know, they're going to find out, they're going to ask, and then your whole family's going to be in trouble and deported. Like all this bullshit that doesn't really exist. So they deal with that. Socioeconomic status plays a huge role, in that transportation. Many of us aren't located in a place that's very easily accessible, and they don't have cars like they depend on public transportation, and I can't imagine them trying to come to me anyway in public transportation. It's impossible. So that's a barrier, and there's a lot of things. Also, there's a historic, it's just there is historic discrimination even within the mental health system that has existed from the beginning, which is now, something that's been worked on and not as prevalent as it used to be, but it's been there. So there's a lot of that has to get dealt with. There's so much misdiagnosing because of the cultural competency pieces in there. And I'm a member of, I'm just going to use my community because one of my communities, if I'm Latina and I come from, people always think we're arguing and fighting if you're from the Caribbean, if you're from the Dominican Republic, you're from Puerto Rico, and you're just having a conversation about pancakes or something, and somebody's walking by, they're thinking you're fighting. They think you're fighting, and because, we're loud, we're animated, we're, we kid around, we yell and scream. Sometimes we are serious, and then we're loving on each other like the next minute. So it seems very, very much like we're in conflict when really we're not. So if we're walking into an office and someone's not aware of that, and that's our tone, right? And we're loud and we're like, it can just come across as if we're histrionic, and so we get misdiagnosed. A lot of the women, like we're histrionic, we're drama oriented, and I know, there's this huge statistics in the Black community with Black women who come in to get, and they really have issues, right? Coming to see non-Black or non-minority providers, because there's this expectation that they're angry and they're Black and they're loud and they're this and that and everything else. So they come into your office and you are already expecting that they're going to, I'm not, but I'm saying someone who isn't culturally competent has like these predisposition about what these people are like and how and they already have sort of like an idea of what's the matter. And it has nothing to do with that. This is just like, you ever go to church with them and you see how happy and proud they are? Like, come on. Like, they don't have that experience. So, but they think they do because they're coming from a good place and they really want to help, but they end up causing more injury than not. And then that person leaves and never wants to come back to therapy.
Yeah. No, it's hard not to, I feel, as a therapist, or maybe as a client too, or maybe just as a human being, not to project your own experience onto another person. As unbiased as we try to be in the counseling room, we have our own life experience and our own culture and our own way of kind of seeing things and interpreting things. And it is hard sometimes to change the lens on that when the person sitting across from you has a completely different background, culture, etc.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, I always tell my clients, be kind to them too, because they're, these providers are in the right place. I remember when I first started out and I went to conferences, the American Counseling Association, I would have, the white therapists come up to me, or the non-veterans come up to me and say, I don't know what to do. I have given up everything to have, this is like when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were going on and everybody was coming back with like real severe need for mental health, and we weren't prepared to deal with them at the VA and all that. So private practice people were trying to have they were leaving their agencies or whatever to do this because they wanted to honestly give back to our soldiers and our Marines and everyone else. But they wouldn't go to them. They would not go to them unless they knew, like they would come to me because I'm a veteran and they knew, I was a veteran. So they would come, but they would not go. And they would very clearly tell me, I'm never going to go to somebody who's not a veteran. So if you refer me out to somebody, make sure that person, and I would try to have the discussion with them about how unfair. But anyway, so at the conferences, the therapists and providers would ask me, what should I do? I'm going bankrupt. I have done everything and put everything into the practice for them to come, and I'm willing to help them, and they just won't come. And I'm like, listen, it's a trust issue. They don't trust civilians. Many of them do not trust civilians. So that's and also put yourself in their shoes. Do you really understand what it's like to be in combat? Do you really and to them, that's like the biggest thing, that even just military culture is a big deal if you don't understand that, because we come back from the military with a completely different frame of reference on the world. Like, we're standing online and you're complaining about your bread is too mushy, at the store. That's like your problem today. We're taking issue with that because we just look at the world much differently when we come back. So I just always used to feel for my colleagues. Oh my God, so sad for you. But what can I do? But, until we started partnering and collaborating and that cultural competency, became real and all that, that's changed somewhat, But it's like with police culture and EMS and all that. They want to go to people who understand what their everyday, that, right? Because of your person. They want people to know that they don't have to explain. Like, they don't have to sit and explain this to you. You're going to kind of know that, and that you're not going to think that that's why I'm here, though. That just informs how I feel, but it's not what I need help with, so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important sometimes to have a therapist or a provider with a shared experience, or at least they know of some part of.
Well, we know what we don't know. I realized that even me, who wants to be the person for all, we'll just say Latinos, or for Hispanic people to come to, I realized even of course I don't know, but you get kind of like cocky when you're starting out and to feel like, yes, I'm Latina, I can take them all. And I was doing case management at a nonprofit, and they were throwing, the Spanish-speaking recent, immigrant people at me to help them in the case management. So I got one from she was from Mexico. And the whole reason that they teamed her with me is because we were both Spanish speaking, and the whole culture thing. They thought they were doing a really great thing. I thought they were doing, because that's what I was there for, to serve them. She came in and we talked in Spanish, we did our thing, and then I think I got up. I said, "Okay, hold on, vengo ahora, da da da," and then she made a phone call, and it was a language I didn't understand, like some language that made no sense to me. I don't know if I ever told you this story. Did I? For our viewers, our listeners, it was a language I did not understand. And long story short, it turned out that I was so arrogant as to think that Spanish was this person's first language because they came from Mexico, and therefore we related so much because of all of that. And it turns out that they identify much more as the indigenous population in their homeland, and they speak their indigenous language. That's their first language, not Spanish, where I made the assumption that Spanish was their first language, even though it was my second language and all that. And when I realized how offensive, that is on my part, to even make those assumptions. And anyway, we had a whole conversation. It was a whole learning experience for me that even I need to understand I don't know everything either. Even if they do look like me and they do speak like me, there's things I don't know about.
Yep.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
I now do things differently with them. But those things are barriers. Like, people want to know that they fit, that you're a good fit.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, I don't even know how long we've been talking, but forever. I'm thinking maybe we should wrap up this podcast with talking about how to find a therapist.
Yeah, good idea.
Concrete advice. So the first, I think, obvious way to, maybe not obvious, but the first suggestion that we have on here on how to find a therapist is to talk to your doctor, talk to your primary care physician. They're going to have a list of referrals, or they should have a list of referrals in their office. And they should have a list of referrals specific for different things that you may be struggling with.
That's how I get a lot of mine. I get a lot of referrals from primary care.
Yeah, absolutely. Doctors. Especially if you trust your doctor,
Yeah.
Just searching on the internet,
Yeah. I mean, and be careful when you search on the internet. Make sure you're not getting one of those, people that call themselves counselors. That should not be. Go to their website, search on the internet, very specifically what you're looking for. Counselors, therapists near me. And then if you're looking for someone who's Spanish speaking, you put that in. Or if you're looking for someone who, domestic violence or depression or, divorce issues, whatever, plug those things in and you'll get a good amount of people to at least call and look on their websites and really vet them to make sure that they fit what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Because that's important. Don't just go to anyone. Go to someone at least who matches the best way possible what you're needing.
Yeah. And counselors or therapists should have their specialties on their website.
Yeah.
So if you're struggling with depression and then you go to someone's website and they specialize in trauma and children and, maybe that's not the best fit. Read the bios, look at their Google reviews if you trust that kind of stuff. And then maybe even ask your doctor, like, hey, have you heard of this therapist? What do you think about them? So do your intel, I suggest. Asking friends and family for a referral.
Those are great ones.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because usually there's someone who knows someone who's heard of someone who went somewhere and they loved that person or was helpful and whatever, and they want to recommend that person just like they do with OBGYNs and dentists and things like that. Use your friends. Use your people, use your churches, use your places and ask. And I know that can be a little funny because of the stigma and maybe privacy issues, but there are people you can trust. Figure out who you can trust. Ask them.
Yeah. Or just make friends with a therapist, and then we can
refer you to you.
A big resource is Psychology Today, which is every therapist I know has a little bio on Psychology Today. That's the actual name of the website. You just Google Psychology Today, and it'll pop up. And it has little bios of the therapist in your area. You can type in your city or your zip code, and it'll populate all these people that you can go see. And it'll also have their specialties and their rate if they accept health insurance. It's basically like the Cliff Notes version of that therapist.
Yeah. And we just want to make clear that we're not affiliated with Psychology Today. We don't endorse them. We don't not endorse them. We're completely neutral. We're on there. It's just a resource that we want people to know exists. So we're not here to judge them. We don't know anything other than the fact that they are a resource to find therapists and counselors.
Yep.
And even support groups and counseling groups.
Oh, they have support groups on Psychology Today.
Mine is on there, yeah. But of course, we're not doing groups because of COVID. But yeah, you can put them in there, and I've gotten a lot of people reach out asking me about the groups.
Awesome.
From there, so we can talk about that. So.
I think that's it.
I think that's it, because we can't get into this next one on this one right now.
Yeah.
Therapy is a great option if you think that there's something that you're struggling with that an objective person can help you with. Friends and family make an effort, but they're not the right people. They cannot provide therapy or counseling for you. They can provide support. So, we'll put a lot of resources and other links and information that all of our listeners can sort of go to in our show notes, and even contact us on a little email and ask us questions, and we'll help guide you. And if you want us to do another episode to kind of continue this sort of information and this kind of conversation, let us know. We'll be happy to provide you with more guidance on that. Yep.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
So we're signing off. All right, guys. Thank you so much for being here and supporting us, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, Victoria here. Thanks for listening to Studio Talk. We hope you enjoyed our conversation into all things related to mental health. As always, you can head over to Studio Talk on YouTube or on Xiomara's website at thex-studio.org, where you can click on the podcast tab on the top menu. Sign up for our email list is there, as well as check out all the links and resources, including Xiomara's website, in the show notes. That's all for this episode, and we hope to see you next time. If you are experiencing any psychological distress, please call 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.